Hi everybody, this is the Baseball Head, the amazing, spectacular, terrific, the great one, the People's Champion, your host, the Hunt. Welcome back to the Baseball Head 3, and hopefully you like this video and hit that subscribe button. So, one of the things we know if you pay attention is that the Disney Corporation does not have any more ideas. They haven't had any real good ideas in a very long time. I mean, they've taken a lot of intellectual properties that they did not create, and they really haven't added anything to it. And they always do this sort of retreads. They always do these sort of reboots on movies, or they take cartoons and they twist them into live action movies, like The Little Mermaid, the original. Then they turned it into some weird kind of some cross-eyed girl as as a Little Mermaid, or all these, or what they did with Snow White. They don't have any ideas, and basically it's because of they've rejected beauty as a concept. They're corporate. They don't care about beauty. They just want to make money, and that's it. And they hire all the worst kind of people to run all these different production companies that they have and that they control. Disney's a big company. They own so much you don't know. Well, they also own ESPN. Now, Bomani Jones put out a thought, and I thought it was interesting to talk about this because I do have some experience talking about Disney and comics and Marvel and DC. Well, they don't own DC, but I have a pretty good idea of the kind of nonsense that they spew. And Bomani, I don't think understands this. So I have a headline from Awful Announcing. Bomani Jones on ESPN, quote, "They're out of ideas." When you don't have beauty as the basis behind what you're doing, you're never going to find those ideas. From where I sit, I don't see a vision for the content. No kidding. Bomani Jones was part of many ESPN's most adventurous content experiments during his nearly 20 years at the company, from writing on Page 2 to the Eric Ride-Home universe of shows to podcasting. 2 years after departing the company, Jones fears that ESPN is no longer in the business of trying much of anything adventurous. During an appearance on the Marchand sports media podcast this week, Jones, who was typically reticent to weigh in on his former employer, the way many others do, described his concerns of the lack of vision under the current leadership at Bristol. From where I sit, I don't see a vision for the content. Maybe a vision exists, but I don't see a vision for content, Jones said. This used to be a place that was in the business of developing shows. That's not what they care about anymore. That's not really what they do now, because it is very difficult to be creative when you reject the basic premises behind beauty and where it comes from, and that's the truth. During the network's heyday as a cable television cash cow, it meant that stars had provided viewers with interesting, engrossing programs. ESPN reimagined sports and news on TV, and meant that stars from multiple generations dating back to its beginnings in southeastern Connecticut. But particularly since Jimmy Pintaro and Burke Magnus took over in the late 2010s, Jones explained he thinks that the creativity is sorely lacking. That makes sense. That's around the same time Marvel Comics started losing, or a little before that, Marvel Comics started losing their creativity as a company in terms of the comics. When you bring in ideologues, and they're ideologues. If they've been there that long, they're ideologues. When I watch ESPN, I don't feel like creativity is what anybody's looking for, he added. What I think they are looking for, and I think this has been made abundantly clear, is that they used to be like MTV in the 1980s. And they were notorious for this in the sense that they weren't paying people a whole lot of money because they felt like we make stars. They can't do that anymore. Nope. Part of it, too, is that why would you want to work for ESPN if you're a sort of a person that wants to be a broadcaster, when there's so many other avenues for you, like podcasting, being a YouTuber? There's no reason to do that. And you could be your own boss, and you don't have to spew all that nonsense, and you don't have to be told what to say. They will get told what to say. Quote, "They can't do that anymore." I mean, really, you think about it, ESPN was very imaginative, and they were able to present sports, and were able to present so many different sports and so many weird sports. They don't do that anymore. It's like MTV. They don't play any music videos anymore. I don't know what the hell they play. Movies. Before running content, the seemingly hands-off Magnus came up overseeing college sports and then overall sports programming. Magnus effectively was in charge of negotiating live sports rights deals for the network. As content head, Magnus has remained primarily focused on games at the expense of new programming or editorial ideas. Jones pointed to the mega deal signed by Stephen A. Smith earlier this year as an example of the trap ESPN now finds itself in. ESPN of yesteryear would have played hardball with Smith on the pretense that they could replace him internally. Now they have to pay up to keep stars or partner with external ones. Yeah, the thing about Stephen A. Smith is I don't think he's that interesting. I think he's just one of these people that screams. And then when you corner him into something that's past, above his pay grade, he comes across as a stuttering idiot, like I just said. Based on his experience as a viewer and then a staffer, Jones credited ESPN for being visionary early in its history, but now Jones argued the company's drawing blanks. They're out of ideas, or at least, the very least, nobody's in the business of coming up with new ideas. And you could say what you want about ESPN, but for the majority of its existence, it was a fairly visionary company when it came to content. They took a lot of chances that didn't necessarily work. When pushed by host Andrew Marchand, who also worked at ESPN under former president John Skipper, and has coached sports media the years since, to account for the fact that ESPN has always been geared around live games, with Jones agreed. But they always had different sports on. That's the only thing. They had different kinds of sports. That was kind of outside the mainstream. They don't do that anymore. But Jones also highlighted the big difference he sees now, which is that the worldwide leader is far more obvious about its ties to leagues and reliance on live game rights than ever before. A pregame or postgame show may, in previous eras that ESPN have included, an irreverent Lee Corso, a wisecracking Bill Simmons, or an impassioned Stuart Scott. Now, when the games aren't on, ESPN is largely overtaken by former athletes. While Jones acknowledged the push for ESPN to conduct capital J journalism may be overblown, he believes the network's perspective is far more informal and positive than it once was. Cool. What I think is different is the shoulder programming around the live events feels much more geared toward promoting the live events than discussing them, critiquing them, so forth and so on. I think the part that jumps out to people now is that symbiosis feels a bit more transparent, perhaps than it did before. That's another thing. They have to kowtow to these leagues. They can't just sort of rip into the commissioner of baseball, and meanwhile, they have a partnership with MLB. Same thing goes with Roger Goodell. They partner with the NFL. They're very close with the NFL. They can't be too critical of the commissioner. They can't be too critical of the ownership. They can't be too critical of the players. They can only take it so far. Either during a game or during these crazy shows that they have. And quite frankly, they're, the content they do have is just people screaming hot takes and all this nonsense. They bring in, Chris Manto, Russo coming in, acting, just acting like Chris and just crazy, or Stuart Scott who could barely, who's another guy that sounds smarter than he actually is. And that's what you get at ESPN. And there's a reason, and also at the same time, when we have Major League Baseball as a premise in terms of the national games, it's tough to listen to because a lot of times these broadcasters just don't follow the team every day, so they're at a disadvantage. You always feel that the play-by-play guy is rooting against your team. It's a very it's a very strange situation. And like I said, the creativity is just not there. They used to do all these great documentaries on the history of sports. They haven't done that in a long time. And it's tough to watch. They used to do a lot of stuff. Remember that they used to have like a countdown, the 100 greatest athletes, and they should have the 100 greatest athletes of the last 25 years. They haven't done that. That would be cool to watch. But they damn done it. Whatever. But the Jones is right. You know, there is no creativity, but it comes down from Disney. It trickles from the top and goes down to the bottom. Trickles down to the bottom. That's how it is. You know. So you let me know what you think about this video, and of course, please subscribe to the Baseball Hut 3. We're talking about sports media. And thank you for watching. I'll see you later.